I'm honored to be here. I'm very happy to be able to present this paper, which is co-authored with my colleagues Magnus and Jakob at Copenhagen and my colleague Georg Schor at the University of Tennessee. This is truly the very first draft of this work. And so this is very much work in progress, and we'd be thrilled to get your first impressions, comments, suggestions, as we're still very much willing to make big changes to this project. In a sense, we're aiming to try and contribute to answering two questions. One is a very high level question about informational barriers impeding firm level trade. So thinking about what the firm doesn't know and how that lack of information might deter firms from entering and growing into new markets, particularly international markets. And then secondly, what government can do to alleviate those informational frictions to the degree that they can be alleviated. And in particular, we're thinking about programs like that are firm-specific, targeted programs like what we typically call promotion. The context we're going to be working in is Denmark, and the Danish Trade Council doesn't do promotion. Maybe promotion isn't the most accurate word to describe what they do, so I'm going to largely use the word support. Thinking this is trade support services, and I'll explain exactly what I mean by that in a few slides. But can governments alleviate these frictions? And if so, what is the sort of cost-benefit analysis on those programs? Is a question that we hope to eventually answer. I honestly don't, we haven't quite made it that far yet, but sort of big picture, that's where we hope to go. And so I'm going to start with a puzzle, and that puzzle actually is really related to a paper we just completed. So the same group of co-authors and I have a forthcoming piece in the Review of Economics and Statistics that uses reduced form methods to causally estimate the impact of support programs on Danish support programs on firm fundamentals. So prices, costs, product quality, production technique, and demand. And it turns out that these support programs have remarkable return on investment. Profits are estimated to increase for the firms that take them up on the investment something like 500%. So they're remarkably profitable. And yet almost nobody does it. Only about 3% of firms in Denmark are actively doing this. And so it begs the question, why? And we think that these informational frictions might help rationalize why we have such a profitable policy alternative that firms can self-select into, but almost no one does it. And so we're going to develop a model. It's going to be an endogenous a model of endogenous decisions among forward-looking firms to export and purchase these support services. And we're going to use two unique features of the Danish context to sort of recover bounds, at the very least, on sort of nominal and informational frictions to trade. The first unique feature is that you can self-select into the promotion program, but the Danish Trade Council also does random outreach to firms. So they randomly contact firms to explain to them what their programs are. And so we're going to be able to see that in the data. The second thing is that most of these programs, as I'll explain in a slide or two, are informational in nature. They're not really changing anything structurally about how the firm produces or what they produce or the quality or the price, so on and so forth. So these are really sort of informational services in nature. And so we're going to use that estimated model to then try and quantify what the premium, what the return is, how, in some sense, to build on our previous work, how do the firms increase their demand in these foreign markets. And so in our previous work, we found that it increased demand primarily. Today we're going to distinguish that into two different types. We think of one way to increase demand is by increasing the number of buyers you have in a new market, so finding new customers, so to speak. The other one is to improve the quality of your customers. And what we think of that is going from a small buyer to a big buyer. And we're going to see which of those support is primarily aimed at. And then eventually we'd like to evaluate the costs and benefits of expanded or targeted support policies. And I'll show you it maybe a first pass if I'm really, really efficient with the time. If not, we'll just have to, we'll see how far we get. So in 75 minutes or less now, I am hoping to talk a little bit about related literature, tell you some background about the Danish Trade Council, document, tell you what the data looks like, hopefully be efficient through the model and estimation strategy, and give you a taste of some findings.
Joel?
Yes.
I was wondering about what kind of information the programs give. Is it about how they are able to export, like bureaucratic things, or yeah, what is exactly the information they provide?
Yeah, so I'm one slide behind you. And if you look at the bottom of this slide, the most common services purchased by these firms target demand side information. So the most common one is called partner search, or is a set of services that are bundled together under what we call partner search. And it's really about finding you a buyer. That's what all that service is really about, or finding you a new buyer. The second most common service I've bundled together, a set of services we've bundled together under the nomiker foreign marketing. And it really is, the most common thing among foreign marketing is facilitating your participation in local trade fairs, i.e. getting you a spot and helping you contact buyers and build a network through trade fairs and other domestically oriented industry networking events. And then the third most common service is market intelligence, which is really performing or helping you facilitating research on market conditions, standards, and so on and so forth in the target market. So those are sort of the three big services. There are, I think, in total a list of something like 25 different services. But for the most part, very few firms purchase things beyond those three. So that's why we tend to think of them this in practice as largely being a demand-driven exercise. And so let me tell you.
Joel?
Yeah.
Sorry, Gustavo here. But these services are mostly for like for new export destinations, like destinations that were not tried it before. For example, like exporting to the United States would be something like, or some like big states, like it would be something that is commonly done, and basically you can have that information from other sources, like your peers or in the same business or something like that. I mean, like, is this information like targeted to certain like more exotic destinations, or is it more like widespread? Because maybe I was wondering that maybe like the fact that you're just considering like this source of information that is public, like state provided, like publicly provided, and not the one that can be obtained like privately from your peers. Maybe could you also explain like the low take up?
Yeah. So I'll have two comments to that. One is absolutely that with respect to this, I'm going to start with the second question. Could you learn this information otherwise? And the answer is sure. You would expect then take up to be low because they're not offering you anything you don't already know or you can't already acquire more cheaply elsewhere. If that's the case, you would expect that the causal impact from getting a call and participating in these programs would be small, right? Like the impact of working with the Trade Council should be small if you already are, have the best information as to who the best buyer is, or you understand how to kind of connect with firms in these foreign markets well, buying firms. And that's not what we found. So the question, to some degree, is if the return is big, why isn't this information pervasive? Of course, there are other ways of acquiring it, and one of the things we'll consider is that experience in a market might also be one way of acquiring it. And so that is something we looked for spillovers across firms with respect to this particular information. There might be other information that spills over across firms. But in our previous work, when we looked for spillovers across firms, products, and locations, we didn't find that. One of the reasons for there being very little spillover across locations is that effectively these programs are all independently run out of the Danish embassies and consulates. And so it's completely decentralized rather than being centralized in any fashion. And to be completely honest and transparent, the first author on this paper, Magnus Booth, used to be employed as one of the people who made these calls for the Danish Trade Council. And so we have a lot of information, and in the sense that really these calls are truly random. But that said, could there be other sources of information, other types of information that A, is present, important, and spills over? Yes, and that's something probably worth thinking a bit more about than we have so far. So I'm not going to speculate too much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I need to write down all these comments, so I apologize if I might as well stay with this slide now that we're here. And so I think we've covered what the information is. It is costly, even if the TC calls you. You do have to pay for it. The prices are standard and they're fixed by service, so it is truly like a fixed cost type exercise. Let's go back one slide. So this is a firm growth paper in international markets. You'll see me lean heavily on our previous work a lot. It's fairly computationally intensive. What I'm going to show you today, that's why we only have one set of results. And we're definitely shutting down some margins at the benefit of others to make this to be as fair as possible. And so feel free to ask those questions, because sometimes we've thought carefully about that, try to think carefully about that as much as possible. But of course, there are others that we might be missing. The advantage of this approach is that we think it's a new way of quantifying information frictions that hasn't been used before, and hopefully we can add to this growing literature that document this potentially particularly important non-tariff trade barrier, and maybe think about a policy response to it. So I'm going to tell you about the Danish machinery industry, a subcomponent of Danish manufacturing export, the largest one. I should have quotation marks around the word frequent buyer here in terms of export support services, because it's going to turn out that no industry buys them all that often. But of the industries that do, machinery is perhaps one of the industries that uses it more commonly. And we're going to focus on the 2010-2015 period due to data access. So we have up to 2015, and we wanted to abstract from the Great Recession, given that the decline in the Great Trade Recession in and of itself might have created differential reasons for using export support that are not generally present. The data is going to come from three sources. One is sort of standard balance sheet data, revenues and costs by type. I'm going to match that to customs records that have export revenues, but in particular the number of buyers and the number of sales per buyer information. And then we're going to match that to Trade Council data, which gives us information on the support purchases made from the Trade Council by firm and product and destination. This is Danish data, so the advantage of it is that there's no matching concerns. Everything, it's basically the universe of firms. but it doesn't mean that it's perfectly unlimited. There are a couple limitations that are worth highlighting. The first is that there's no buyer information within the EU. They don't track that at all. And so largely, we're not going to focus on the EU because I'm not going to be able to tell you a whole lot about where or how or the support affects demand. And then there's a great deal of sparsity. So, you know, how do I, the Trade Council offers support services to over 77 countries, but there really isn't a lot of variation in many of those countries. And so we're going to focus on only a couple big export markets, the US and China. It's simply the model probably is not, it's not feasible to estimate the model in many countries beyond those sort of major markets. But otherwise, the data looks a lot like the types of export data that we've come to know and appreciate. Exporters tend to be much bigger than non-exporters. That's what the top panel of this slide should show you. And exporting is relatively rare. And relatively is in quotation marks here because, as you can see, 60% of firms, Danish firms, export somewhere. And that's largely due to the fact that they have these close, geographically close and ethnically close neighbors in Sweden and Norway, which are and Germany, which are very common export destinations. But exporting to the US or to China is substantially less frequent. Export support is remarkably rare. So only about less than 6% of firms get any support anywhere in the machinery industry, and that's, you know, sort of typical. To the US or to China specifically, it's just over 1% of firms that are engaged in this activity. And so it's very, very uncommon. And that's going to show up later in sort of a, you know, sort of the puzzle. Given the return to this activity, why is it so infrequent? And so I want to build the model around, to use what data we have.
Joel, can I ask a question? Also,
please do.
From the bank. Does it change a lot if you like weight it by sales or something, like the bottom table? It's just I'd like to know more than anything. Just out of curiosity, right? Because it's around 5.6% of firms, not of sales, or not of like total exports or something.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can speak to it a little bit, but the short answer is I don't know. I have to weight by sales. I wish I did know. And the reason I'm not even going to hazard a guess is that there's you can think of there being two types of firms that are engaged in support. One is, and this is going to come across in some of our facts. One are firms that are struggling to survive in a new market. And the firms that are struggling to survive are typically kind of small and not that productive, not that big, very low sales. The other set are actually big firms that are succeeding and are using these services to grow even bigger, to really, you know, flourish in a market. And which group is going to end up, there are going to be a lot more small firms, but their weight is going to be small because their sales are small. I don't want to hazard a guess, but that would be a useful thing for us to include and to think about. So I agree that's something we should have in the next version.
Right, because I guess
I apologize for not knowing, but that is a
no. But I also would imagine that it's, well, of course gonna, like, you can say like how much of each firm is also like being supported by this. I guess you are gonna say that's their whole sales. Like, are there like spillovers within the firms when it comes to this? Like, yeah, I don't know. Like, is it like a firm, or is it like a firm region too? You know, like.
So this is the interesting thing is that the the services are tailored to destination, product, firm. So it really is very tailored. We're going to treat all the firms as sort of being single product firms, or thinking of the firm selling a bundle of goods. So we're not going to distinguish one product from another. Mostly there's a clear core product for most of these firms.
Right.
That said, you would expect, for instance, or one of the things that we anticipated that in our previous work, that if you got great support services for the United States, for instance, you might have a leg up in entering Canada. Or likewise, if you got great support services for Sweden, that would teach you something about Norway. And we went out and we looked for that, and looked for it as much as we could in our previous work, and we could not find it. It actually seems to be very uniquely, it does have a big impact, but it's a very targeted impact as far as we can tell. So I can't rule it out any more than and to rely on what we've done so far. So that's my answer. I don't think there are big spillovers, and I'm quite confident in that, in the sense that we've tried substantially to overturn that belief, but so far it looks like it's pretty targeted.
Right. Thank you.
So the first fact is not super controversial, hopefully, and that's that if you receive support, it's going to increase the probability of entering target markets. This has been shown in various different papers. So we're going to conduct a simple probit where the probability of entering E is equal to 1 if you enter, is a function of your past entry history in that market and whether you got support from that market, and a series of covariates like productivity and capital. Will include destination year fixed effects, so on and so forth. And then in the bottom panel, what I'm presenting are predicted export probabilities. So rather than showing you coefficients, I'm just going to show you the difference in the mean export probability between supported groups, that is when S is equal to 1, and unsupported group firms when S is equal to 0. And so for the US and for China in columns 1 and 5, you can see there's about the probability of entering is about 5 times higher among supported firms than unsupported firms. Now, we didn't include any controls there purposely to document the fact that that gap shrinks, and it shrinks substantially if you start including controls. So ignoring covariates, there's a significant role for firm heterogeneity in explaining who selects into which market. It's not all just, in some sense, support. But plainly, without imposing a particularly causal interpretation on support, because you could there's a selection into support issue also. Supported firms, for whatever reason, are much more likely to enter target markets. The second fact is that supported firms, for whatever reason, are much more likely to survive in target markets. And again, we conduct a probit where the outcome variable is whether you're in the market as a function of your age in that market and whether you're supported or not. And what we see in column 1 is that you're much more likely to make it to the next year if you're supported than if you're not. That gap doesn't shrink very much even once we include covariates. And that's not maybe the most surprising thing. The thing that caught us a little bit by surprise is that even at age 4, that gap is still present. So you're more likely to stay in the market even after 4 years. Support is still doing something for survival. Now, well, in the interest of time, I'll just go on there. That's the main thing. Fact 3 is that supported firms have higher export sales among surviving firms. This comes with an important caveat. That surviving firms clause is important. Doesn't necessarily mean that supported firms always have higher export sales. But if you survive, your sales are greater. And I'll try and give you a sense of how we show that. So we consider an Ols regression, as in Dorian Fitzgerald's recent paper and with co-authors, How Exporters Grow, where we take log export values and we regress it on a fully saturated specification of indicator variables for export spell age and duration. So there's a sense and we want to think about export spells of the same length, say 5 years, and then compare what your sales looked like at year 2 and year 3, and be able to compare that to sales in year 2 of different export spell lengths. And then we're going to make one more distinction, and we're going to distinguish supported firms and unsupported firms. So S bar is an indicator for whether a firm receives a support or not during the spell. And so you get pictures that kind of look like this. And we can do this for any spell length. I think we have 6 years of data, so 6 is the max. But I'm only going to present 3 spells because if I add more lines, the figure gets almost impossible to read. And so we have 3 spell lengths that we're going to focus on. The green are long spells, the gray are short spells, and the blue are medium length spells. The solid line are the revenue paths for unsupported firms, and the dashed lines are the revenue paths for supported firms. So let's look at the green lines first, where we have exports. The dashed line is always above the solid line, which is saying something like, among supported firms, export sales are higher for these long export spells. I should note, I forgot to note, that everything is measured relative to 1-year exporters that had no support. That is the 0 dot there at 1. So everything's relative to that. The gray line, though, shows the exact opposite pattern. And that's that the dashed line is always below the solid line. And we like to think of this distinction as sort of showing off 2 different, potentially 2 intuitive but different mechanisms that are going on at the same time. One is that support, like we found in our previous work, does have this causal impact of boosting demand. It is having a big impact among these firms that are really productive. It does also add something to your demand base. On the other hand, for the gray lines, you're seeing there being strong selection effects. Firms that are struggling to survive are selecting into support to try and maintain a presence in export markets. And then the blue lines are somewhat in between. And so the dashed line is most commonly above the solid line, but sometimes below it too, in the sense, and so you have both this boost in demand and selection going on at the same time. And so we wanted to see whether that is largely driven by the number of firms or whether support is doing something with regards to sales per firm. And what turned out to be surprising to us, maybe because we had no prior, so any result would have been surprising, was that you get roughly the same figure when you look at export value per buyer or when you look at the number of buyers. So support is always seems to be improving things for these long-term exporters, but there's also some selection effects that we want to account for. And so our model is going to want to reflect both of these mechanisms at the same time. All right, and so I want to be careful with my time here, so I'm going to tell you about the model. Some parts of it are very standard, some of it is somewhat new, and so I'll probably hurry a little bit through the standard components in order to try and get to some of the results. It's going to be CES demand and constant marginal cost. There's going to be a sunk cost when you enter a market for the first time, and a fixed maintenance cost that you pay per period thereafter. Firms are going to be forward-looking and thinking about the long-run profit of entering a market. What's new is that we're going to have this possibility of getting support, and so the support is costly, and we're going to allow there to be a sunk and fixed cost associated with contracting with the TC. But the TC might also call you. And all of these costs are going to have both sort of nominal, or the what you pay component, and an informational component. TC support is going to be allowed to do a variety of things in the model. Maybe it's going to mitigate sunk or fixed costs. Maybe it's going to boost the number of firms you reach. Maybe it's going to improve the average buyer quality. So preferences in just a few seconds are CES, like I said. One reason we chose CES, just plainly, is that we found no evidence that pricing mattered, or price support, or affected pricing in any way. And so this makes things as simple as possible. And we're going to aggregate all of the demand effects into this, this term Z, which shows up right here just as an idiosyncratic demand shifter. But otherwise, it's very standard CES. Production, we have constant marginal costs, where your marginal costs are a function of your capital stock. So larger firms are going to have lower marginal costs. They're also declining in firm level productivity omega. And W is just a variable capturing input prices in Denmark. And productivity is going to evolve according to a markup process that we model simply as an AR1 process. We tried out various specifications here early on, and adding additional terms to the markup process didn't really seem to improve performance. So we stuck with something simple. So this I want to take a little more time with. So we're used to seeing sunk costs and fixed costs in entry models of exporting. And so we're going to have one here. This gamma S is the sunk entry cost a new exporter has to pay if it enters market J. But we're going to think of it as being having two components. One is this nominal component, gamma NS. And in some sense, as example, I can think of that as what I have to pay to contract with the distributor to carry my good in market J. And then there's this gamma IS, which I like to think of as the informational costs associated with that, which is something like I need to, before I enter a market, I need to figure out which distributor I want to go with, I want to contract with. And there's going to be a set of uncertainty and potentially contracting failures, so on and so forth, for all sorts of reasons that might be associated with that. We're going to bunch all of that into what we call this sort of informational entry cost. Now, when you enter, you might choose also to be supported by the Danish Trade Council. And if you do, then you're going to get a discount. And in particular, we're going to assume you get a discount delta IS on these informational costs. The reason we think of it pertaining to the informational costs is that at the end of the day, these costs are, the Danish Trade Council is not actually distributing anything for you, nor are they actually changing the contractual relationship. All they're doing is providing you with better information. And so we're going to put the delta there, and then this delta S is going to be the sort of normalized discount you get over total entry costs.
Joe?
And the approach, yes.
Sorry, maybe this comes later, but when you were discussing the evidence,
Yeah.
I interpreted, or it seemed to suggest that the match when the firm is supported is of a better quality, no? Because they last longer, they sell more, and so on. But here you're modeling it through sunk costs. Yeah.
So let me answer that question quickly, and then I'll see if I guess one thing I want to be clear about is yes, those things are going to show up on just the next slide. So I promise we'll get there, or 2 slides. Give me 2 slides. Here I want to say what I'm doing is I'm allowing there to be a cost component. And maybe that's the language I should have used, and that would have been more appropriate. I'm allowing there to be a cost component. And a reason we think of there being, a cost component is that if you think about why few firms enter, like why a firm might not enter a new market, it simply might be, I don't know how to find a new buyer. And so that, when we put it into a standard model, is going to show up like a sunk cost or like a fixed cost if you're an incumbent, and finding a new buyer. And so this is sort of, in some sense, a residual, if you like, to soak up why the firm doesn't do something. And it's going to be a convenient way to model it too, in the sense that it's going to allow us to put a dollar value on that component that deters you from entering. But I will show you where the premium shows up in demand shortly. Fixed costs, you're going to have the exact same structure for unsupported and supported firms. So supported firms are going to get a discount on the informational component.
Why is sorry for my question, but in that's the fixed cost in every period, but after the firm enters the market, why would it get an additional effect in every additional period?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the short answer is, by no means does it need to be there. In fact, in our first run estimates, we don't find anything for China. So in one case, it turns out to be 0. But you might expect it, in the sense that even if I've entered a market last year, there might be a benefit to still contracting with support services. And a relatively high fraction of the firms that do contract with the Danish Trade Council are doing it for markets they've already entered. And so in some sense, that there's a reason there's some information that I'm missing, or there's something that the Danish Trade Council that's offering to me of value, if I'm willing to engage in that exchange with them, even in markets I'm already have a presence in.
Okay.
Now, to get this information, I contract with the Trade Council. I can do so in one of 2 ways. One is to search for the Trade Council program myself. And I think roughly about half of the cases come through that. And so we're going to put costs on that. We're going to estimate those costs. And then we're going to be able to compare them to some of the data we have on costs. So for first-time buyers, we're going to let theta S be the sunk cost associated with finding and searching out the Trade Council itself, where this is a nominal cost associated with purchasing the program, and also this informational cost associated with figuring out what this program is, how it exists, who I contact, would it work for my firm, so on and so forth. And then we're going to also allow there be per period costs for individual firms. Secondly, you could also get a call from the Trade Council, and there's going to be a cost associated for first-time buyers. We're going to let that simply be theta C. So we're going to allow the cost first-time buyers pay from these calls to be different from those that if you look for it yourself. And then there are the incumbent buyers who also get calls. So believe it or not, you wouldn't think it, you would think one of the things that the Trade Council might do is not call the people they're already contracting with, but they do. They do give them random calls also and offer their services. And we're not going to allow the parameters to differ for them. So and the reason for that is to really identify theta, I need two things in the data. I need the firms to get a call from the Trade Council. I would need them to have purchased promotion services or support services last year, and I need a meaningful number of observations to say no thereafter. So I need some to say yes and then some to say no to identify these theta coefficients. And not really that many say no if they were already buying support and they get a call. So we fix that as the theta F, the same fixed cost as if you were just someone who found the TC program yourself last year. And that in the previous period, I should say. So due to data limitations, we have to normalize that, so to speak. So demand, which is getting to your question, and it looks a little ugly, but I promise it's not quite as ugly. It's not as awful as it looks. So if you remember, aggregate demand, if aggregate firm specific demand is this Z term. It's got two components. It's got N, the number of buyers, or the log number of buyers to be precise, and A, the quality of the average quality of those buyers. So when we think of average quality as being sort of roughly the average log sales per buyer. And so both of these are going to be modeled as dynamic processes that depend on what you had last year, i.e. if a firm sells to large firms last year, it's probably likely to sell to large firms this year. If it had a lot of buyers last year, it's more likely to have a lot of buyers this year. It's also going to depend on whether you got support last year. And you'll notice that there's a time lag here that we're imposing from, and this comes from our previous work, that the biggest effects from support are really felt in the year subsequent to your first purchase. So you contract with the Trade Council, and then you get a big demand shock the next year. To get to the question of could you find out this information another way, we include last year's export status. And so there's a sense that there's some learning by doing, and certainly that could be the case with alpha 3 and eta 3. And then there's an interaction effect to capture, again, whether these two things are substitutes or complements. And as the previous question, I think, implied, we're actually going to find that there's some substitutability here, so that you can find out a substantial part of this information other ways. And then these last terms are the error terms on these two processes, which we're going to think of as being drawn from a bivariate normal distribution, but that the shocks are implicitly correlated. And this structure is going to give us some return on sort of thinking about how these returns are correlated. So do firms with lots of sellers also tend to have bigger sellers, so on and so forth. We preserve all the usual benefits from this type of structure that, and in particular, that you can go right to revenues pretty easily, and from revenues to profits. And in particular, the one thing that we've been a little bit conscious of doing here, simply because it eases things substantially, is that the markets are all separable. And so we're going to be able to estimate the model sort of in parallel for the different markets. I'm a little late on time, so I will admittedly rush through this a bit, especially since the slides are ugly, and who wants to talk about ugly slides? The value of the firm V depends on whether you get a call, that's the superscript C, or you don't get a call. Those are non-called firms. So lambda is the perceived probability of a call from the point of view of the firm. Regardless of whether you call or not, you then get a call or not, you either end up in this part of the decision tree here, which is VC or VN. And regardless, you have to make a decision whether you want to enter that market or not. If you don't enter, you get 0 in either case. And if you do enter, you get the continuation value V superscript CE, which is a function of the firm's state in that market. The continuation value has this very standard form. It is simply profits, current profits, minus the appropriate set of fixed or sunk costs, depending on your state, plus the continuation value for the future support decision. Now, I'm going to show you the future support decision on the next slide, but one of the things I do want to draw your attention to, because I think it's a subtle but an important decision, is that we've structured the timing so you get a call, then you make an export decision, then you make a support decision. And when you get to the end of the period, you make the support decision where you get the continuation value of the firm. If you decide to buy support, then you pay the appropriate support cost. If you don't, you just continue on without making a support decision in the current period. Could we reverse the timing of the support and export decisions? We could. That is not something we've tried. We did try it with a very old version of this some time ago, and it didn't seem to make a big difference. So I'm guessing it won't anymore, but we've substantially expanded the model, so I can't guarantee that. Could we do them all at the same time? Yes, we could, but it would greatly increase the computational burden. So we're somewhat hesitant to go down that road, but it would certainly be possible. But this is what we've done for today. So I can't show you results for others. Estimation, we're gonna fix some weakly identified parameters, and then I'm gonna cover productivity in sort of a standard way, and then recover sunken fixed costs according to Doss, Roberts, and Tyboot's seminal 2007 piece. But all of this is fairly standard. So I'll go through it fairly quickly. We're not going to estimate the intertemporal discount factor. We're going to set the elasticity of substitution to 5. And we're just going to assume that all the calls that the firms get are surprises, i.e. their perceived probability of a call from the Trade Council is 0. Obviously, we could set it to some very small number. We haven't done that yet. And so I can't say that it won't affect the results, but given that the calls are fairly infrequent, I don't expect it to. Recovering firm productivity is really a 3-step function where we estimate the revenue function with a control function on the right-hand side, recover the fitted values of f hat, that's the control function, where m and n are energy and electricity expenditures. And given that control function, we can write this composite error term as a function of capital and productivity. Using that law of motion for productivity, that AR1 process, we can then recover all of the coefficients in this process by nonlinear least squares and recover a productivity series for each firm. We estimate the sunken fixed costs through Bayesian Markov chain Monte Carlo, largely because these problems have fairly poorly behaved likelihood functions. They kind of have a type 2 Tobit form. And so you often get local minima that are not particularly robust. And so this is one way to get a better search of the full density. The outer loop is a Metropolis Hastings approach to drawing parameter vectors. And so we draw a full parameter vector theta, And then we solve the dynamic program for a series of simulated shocks. We solve that on randomized grid points following rust, compute the likelihood, and then average likelihood across all of the M draws. Given that new likelihood, we use the old likelihood and the new likelihood to draw another parameter vector from the Markov chain, and we repeat this 10,000 times. Throw out the first 2,000 runs, and then I'm going to compute the posterior distribution for all of these parameters. In fairness, I'm not going to I'll present posterior means and standard deviations, and I'll probably talk about them like they're point estimates and standard errors, but that's not worth keeping in mind. That's not exactly what they are. These are all very. This is actually not posterior mean and standard deviation. This is from the productivity process. They have intuitive coefficients. Productivity tends to be persistent, and firms with larger capital stocks tend to have lower marginal costs. The more interesting parameters, the more interesting parameters are here. These are these demand parameters that are new to the literature. There was a tool yesterday where I could write on the screen. I don't see it
on the
here.
top on the right, the little wiggly line.
I think I have to stop sharing my slides to do that. Oh, here we go. I see it. Okay. So first thing is that you can see in each case, demand is fairly persistent, particularly the number of buyers. And so that was true across countries and across each type of demand. Promotion, this is the promotion or the support coefficient. Is positive in each case, but particularly large in China. So promotion seems to have a particularly strong return in China. That said, there are two features that I did want to highlight. The first is that the export experience is even better than Trade Council information in terms of boosting demand. So at least in terms of buyer quality, not so much in terms of the number of buyers. And so one thing that seems to be the case, at least from the point of view of these these coefficients, is that there's a strong benefit to export promotion, particularly among the number of buyers relative to export experience. But with that in mind, it's worth noting that the substitution effects are large. So if we were to compare, for instance, the benefit of promotion for a firm that exported last year in terms of the number of buyers, these three coefficients sum to effectively to 0 in the United States. While in terms of buyer quality, there still seems to be some positive effect. In China, the story is not quite the same. This coefficient is always smaller than the two preceding coefficients. So there's still a benefit to promotion above and beyond what you'd learn from exporting itself, and likewise here. I will omit the other coefficients for sake of time, but will note that these two that the two types of shocks tend to be positively correlated with each other.
Joe,
Yes.
two questions. So the support, if I understood correctly, the support group helps more in terms of finding more customers rather than the quality. Is that
For this is a maybe.
okay?
And then my answer is maybe, because for firms that are new, i.e. that didn't export last year, you certainly see that there's a bigger premium. So your entry, you're going to enter with more buyers. But if you have experience, it's roughly the opposite that's true.
Okay.
And that's maybe really thinking about the U.S. case here. In China, I think the benefits are always particularly large in terms of buyer quality.
I see. And so here is there something generating growth, or all these are mean reverting, right? Or do they generate long run growth of the firm?
So I'm going to show you exactly what kind of export paths they simulate in just a couple of slides. And so we have not we've not embedded a lot of cumulative age effects in some sense on purpose as a benchmark. That is on our to-do list.
Okay.
So that is on our to-do list. Sympathetic to that. I think I have to stop annotating to move on. So the last set of estimates that I want to show you are the I guess I have about 15 minutes, right?
Yep. But
Okay.
you can use more time if you want, but yeah.
Yeah. So I will try and be judicious with the time I have here. So this table presents the estimated sunk costs and fixed costs for the different types of components. They're measured in millions of Danish kroners, and 1 kroner is worth about 20 US cents. So I often have to divide by 5 to remind myself what these actually measure. To give you a sense, this is there are 2 numbers I'll start with. One is the support sunk cost in the US. It's by far the biggest number, and it seems completely crazy. So 13 million Danish kroners to find the Trade Council in the United States, for calls to the United for services to the United States, and it is a crazy big number in some sense, but it's also completely reasonable given the structure of the model. And so I think what's key here is to understand and to remember what it is how the model is delivering that. Why does it deliver such a big number? It delivers such a big number because very few firms do this, despite the fact that the model finds that there's this significant return from doing it. So the demand parameters I'm just showing you are implying that you get more customers and you get better customers, significantly so, if you're engaged with export support. Very few firms are doing it. And so the model rationalizes that by estimating an unbelievably large sunk cost. And that is, in some sense, reflecting the puzzle I had started with. The next number I want to talk about is this support call cost, which is about 110,000 Danish kroners for the United States, or 18,000 Danish kroners for China. And in both cases, that is about almost exactly what our firms report spending on these programs. In some sense, these are very close to the actual nominal amount spent on average, or the median amount spent on average. And so the model is actually returning these something close to these nominal costs, suggesting that the informational cost, the informational component, is potentially very minimal if you get a call. You get this free call. Fixed costs are obviously quite a bit, are in between the two, but very close to the call costs, suggesting that, again, if I've worked with the TC before, the Trade Council before, I've learned a lot of what there is to know, and what's left is mostly or largely nominal costs. So that suggests that there's potentially a strong informational story to be told as to why these firms are not participating in these profitable programs. It also suggests that potentially, if there's this information that's missing that's helpful, that firms will take up if you call them and offer it to them, that export markets are also potentially plagued by those types of frictions. And so when we estimate sunk costs, export sunk costs, we end up with numbers that are basically on par with things you see elsewhere in the literature. Somewhere between, these represent roughly somewhere between 20 to 40% of 1 year's worth of export revenue for the typical export. The sunk costs. The fixed costs are obviously quite a bit smaller. Are they plausibly the size of what actual nominal expenditures are? No, they're really big. They're quite large. So 1.2, Danish kroners is several $100,000 US. If you contract with the Trade Council, those costs fall substantially, and that's the last two rows. This 0.37 suggests that you only pay 37% of the sunk cost if you're being supported by the Trade Council in the United States, or half of that in China. The discounts kind of range much more widely for the fixed costs, but the fixed export costs are arguably already quite modest. And so I wanted to show you some information, some stuff on model performance, but that will completely crowd out the stuff I do want to talk about at the end. So I apologize profusely, but please trust me when I say we fit fact one reasonably well. At least we were surprised we fit it as well as we did. Given that this was a first pass. We fit fact two pretty well in the United States, but not nearly as well in China. And so I think our specification needs some tweaking here, and particularly allowing for some of these growth effects we were talking about just a minute ago might significantly improve performance here, but we have not, admittedly, we have not incorporated that into our paper yet. And then we get these revenue paths that look a lot like what we see in the data. And again, you see that the support is having this particularly large impact for the long tenure exporters, where we've omitted year one because that's taken directly from the data. For those, I'm not sure why it's not plotted actually, now that I look at it. So, but the blue dashed line is closer to the blue solid line, and the gray the gray dashed line is particularly close to the gray solid line in the US. It's not quite as successful in China, but the selection effects there are something where we are not not quite hitting yet. You can see roughly the same patterns in terms of buyer quality and number of buyers, where we do definitely get the selection effects in the US in this last case, but again, don't hit them for China. So now I have to be really careful with the time. So what should I tell you? I'll tell you a little bit about information frictions, and then I'll tell you what we're hoping to do with the counterfactuals, maybe. So the informational frictions, like I said, we have data on the amount that you spend on promotion, and so that allows us to distinguish nominal expenditures from what's left, and what's left we call informational. And for called firms, it looks like most of what we estimate is nominal in nature. So information frictions are small, which is fairly important, we think, because it suggests that these programs, leveraged properly, could resolve big frictions, or potentially resolve big frictions in trade markets. For incumbents, the discounts were smaller, were relatively small, and the implication is that there's still a fair amount of informational friction there, but remember, these costs overall are quite small, so the numbers are quite small. And then for the first-time exporters, or the first-time buyers, I should say, first-time buyers of promotion services, almost everything is informational, because you get these huge estimates, like the 13 million Danish kroners estimates, reflecting the fact that for the vast majority of non-exporting Danish firms that would benefit from these services, or the model implies would benefit from these services, almost none of them engage with the Trade Council. And so the next question is, can we do the same thing for sunken fixed costs in terms of sunken fixed export costs? And we have no direct, well, we have some information on export expenditures that look like they would apply to fixed costs, but we're a little hesitant to call this expenditure a fixed cost rather than a variable cost, so on and so forth. And so instead, we're going to take an indirect approach and say, suppose, can we bound them by making an assumption? Suppose that the Danish Trade Council is really good at what it does, and it's so good, in fact, that once you get their support, that there's no informational friction left. If that's the case, then the fixed and sunk costs among supported firms actually identify the nominal cost of entering an export market. Under that assumption, you can then go ahead and look at what's left and see about a third of the sunk costs in the US are nominal, about 2/3 are informational, and it's about 50-50 in China. So a natural question to ask, though, is that given we have this strong assumption that that is hard to externally validate in any way, is it in any way reasonable? Is this guess in any way reasonable? Well, I will say that the nominal entry costs that we find are roughly 5 to 12% of a year's worth of annual of export revenue. Castro, Lee, Mascus, and G use detailed level nominal expenditure data on export expenditures to quantify or try and add up what the entry cost is in Chile, and they find it to be about 10% of average export revenues. And so our indirect method is coming in around what they found to be approximate for this sort of direct approach. We're working on trying to get Danish data to try and validate this within Denmark as well, but we were surprised, or maybe pleasantly surprised, that the implication was not quite so extreme as you might guess. All right. With 1 minute left, let me tell you a little bit about a policy experiment we're considering, and then I'll very gladly take you know, sort of end there, and we'd be very glad to hear your thoughts. And so the set of policy experiments that we're thinking about really have so far sort of two goals. Is thinking about what would happen if you expanded these services, or what would happen if you targeted buyers to whom they would be very useful, or would increase profits the most. And so the one I'll show you today, the one we've conducted, is one where we increase the number of random calls from the Trade Council by a factor of 5. And we're going to increase the random calls by one time only, so we're not going to continue increasing them in every year, but it's a one-time increase. And then we're going to plot what happens to the export support rate, the export participation rate, average export revenues and its components, and then total export revenue. And not surprisingly, if we call a lot more firms, a lot of firms take up export support, particularly if they weren't doing so before. So you get this large percentage point increase. So that's the top left panel. In terms of export support, remember the baseline rate is only 1%. So these are big increases in some sense, percentage-wise. Export participation, likewise, spikes relative to baseline by about 20%, or just shy of 20 percentage points. Remember, on average, 25% or so of Danish firms export to the United States. So percentage-wise, these are very sharp increases in the number of firms that are exporting to the United States. Average export revenue and its components, buyer quality or the number of buyers, fall and then rise. And the reason for that is that the incumbent set of exporters tend to be very profitable, and the firms that we're drawing in, this is a selection component, the new exporters tend to be smaller and initially have poorer fundamentals, demand fundamentals. And so the averages fall and then grow as surviving firms cement themselves in those markets. Total export revenue increases by about 15% within a couple years, and then falls thereafter as many of these small firms that were in the market and are being supported stop buying support, and their demand isn't sufficient to justify maintaining a presence in the US market, and so they decline. But still, we're looking at total export revenue that is a full 5% above baseline 10 years after. And so we think of that as sort of an interesting way of thinking about the role of export support and information, and potentially being, and these programs at facilitating exporting more so than they are now, certainly at very relatively small baseline rates. But I'll stop there. I have some more slides for China. All findings are highly preliminary, so I don't, please forgive me if you see this in 6 months and I'm saying something slightly different, or maybe very different. But thank you for your time. But I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. We'll keep this recording to see what you say in 6 months. But we have some minutes for additional questions.
So
There are a lot of questions.
I have one small question. So So you left the preferences here like very simplistic. So you are assuming that there is no heterogeneity in the elasticity of demand, but it seems there could be some role because I imagine that you cannot expand so much the extensive margin for products that you have a very inelastic demand in opposition to products that is like really elastic. So is is there something, or I might be missing something?
Yeah, so this is a good question, and something we did think a little bit about, and it shows up in subtle ways. So I'm going to answer your question in two parts. The first part is that once we decided to go a CES for this industry, question is, on one hand, could the elasticity of demand, one way of interpreting a question, could the elasticity of demand be different in the United States than in China? And R. Robertson Zhu have a suggested way of trying to pin that down using similar data. We've tried it. It's 4 point, and we found out there's 4.5 in one country and 5.2 in the other. And off the top of my head, I forget which is which, but they're both pretty close to 5. The reason we chose to fix it at 5 is that if we do so, then we're scaling all the things in the model, because given the log linear form that the CS demand ends up implying, all of these parameters get pinned, are all really a function of sigma. So they're directly comparable to each other in this table because they're all scaled by the same number. Otherwise, we would be scaling by different numbers in terms of interpreting them, and that we felt was a little bit clumsy. So we chose not to do that. The even stronger version, I think, of your question that I put second on purpose is, think about another industry, right, rather than the machinery industry, which might have more inelastic demand, and would we expect the same results to hold? Some parts of it, I'm going to answer based on our previous work, which is to say that overall we found the sort of the same effects of support on mostly being a demand driven phenomenon across all industries. And so that part, I think, would hold. Would it necessarily hold to the same degree in terms of the dimensions that we emphasize? That I don't know. And I think that type of heterogeneity is precisely one of the reasons we chose to focus on one industry alone. Yes. So the short answer is I don't know. And it's probably worth thinking about more, about answering that type of question about industry heterogeneity and demand. But the intuition you provide is cogent, right? You might suggest that in an industry where there's completely inelastic demand, there's just little scope for these programs to operate, and that seems completely reasonable. So you might need some degree of differentiation for that to be the case, or some degree of differentiation that where people are willing to substitute between products. I guess it's got to be somewhat elastic.
Joel, can I ask you something? This is Federico from the bank.
Hello.
Hi. So there's an alternative potential story for why the take-up is low, which is, it's just a capacity constraint. Let's think of it like, a managerial capacity constraint. It's not necessarily that the firms don't know about the programs or the benefits of these options. It's just that, they have limits in terms of, managerial stuff, bureaucratic stuff, things like that. And I guess the issue or the challenge is that, the managerial constraints potentially interact with the information constraint in the sense that, if you improve the information, probably maybe you're going to relax a bit the managerial constraints, but still you're going to have those there. So I guess my question is whether you have thought about which results in that you have would sort of violate or kind of go against this alternative mechanism, or maybe to what extent you can think of, interventions that could test, which is more profitable, whether relaxing the informational constraint or the managerial constraints. And there are a lot of programs that people evaluate in, sub-Saharan Africa or etc. in terms of helping firms, in terms of managerial constraints. But I haven't seen any, so far, like a horse race in some sense between those two sort of types of constraints firms have, and it would be kind of nice to know, your thoughts on it, on kind of which moments in the data would be kind of helpful in terms of separating out which one is more relevant.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm gonna start. I won't be able to completely answer it, but I think it's a lot of fun to think about. So the capacity constraint at the firm level. Obviously, the firm might have other constraints that interact with the informational component, and I think it's completely fair and completely correct to say that we are sort of loading that all into these fixed and sunk cost parameters, and so everything we estimate is, especially as the informational component, is a residual type approach, and so it captures all of these things, and especially the interaction things. And so that is absolutely, I agree with that interpretation completely. So with respect to particular mechanisms, surely one of the things that is on our to-do list is to actually allow the model to have more heterogeneity across the distribution of firms. And so, for instance, the thing that we wrote down was not managerial constraint, which was just something maybe less interesting even than that. It was just simply to allow for all the costs to vary by size. So think of there being firms being in certain size bins, and it could just be that large firms are better informed and so have less use for the TC services, or they already have similar activities going on in-house. And so you would find different results for small firms than for big firms. Likewise, you could do the same thing by looking at something across firms with different amounts of expertise. What exactly we have in the data that measures would capture expertise, I'm not sure. It is Denmark, so it may require matching with another data set, but I wouldn't be surprised if we could find out something about the nature of managers or the education of managers or so on and so forth. With respect to the literature broadly, I think there's sort of two things that stand out to me. The first one is one of my favorite papers by Amit Khandelwal and co-authors, who conduct an experiment where they give a manufacturer's information on how to better produce output in a randomized controlled trial. And one of the things they find in that context is that it was a lot harder to get uptake than they expected. Because even if you get the managers on board, you need to get the workers to implement it. Excuse me. Forgive me. Dry throat. In our case, in our previous paper, we were surprised. So we knew from previous work, two of my co-authors had done, even preceding that paper, that supported firms had bigger export sales. And so the question was why? And one of the things we spent a lot of time talking about, was it possible that you were learning, the Danish Trade Council was helping you learn how to produce better, i.e. you were getting, there's some interaction with managerial expertise. And we found nothing. We found there like a very consistent set of zeros and very precisely estimated set of zeros in terms of marginal costs and productivity, however estimated. Now, does that mean there couldn't be an interaction effect? No. And so that is something that hopefully next time I present the paper or you see it, if it'll we'll have something more to say. Certainly it's on our to-do list there. And I think the capacity constraint is pretty a pretty reasonable interpretation along the same lines of what we're thinking.
Thanks.
Okay, let me see if there are no more questions.
I also had a last
Go
question. Ahead. When you do the counterfactual about this policy that would increase 5 times this call, I wonder, like, does the model, and maybe sorry if I missed a detail, but does the model contemplate the fact that like if they all receive the call, if all have this, they're all gonna like there is some effects on the other firms. So like there is a point that you can increase this call, but it only works like as a partial kind of instrument, but not maybe as the whole, unless you are like competing with certain like with other exporters to the US from other countries. I don't know how those things play into that counterfactual exercise you do.
Yeah, so this is a great question for it. And the answer is no. So everything was very partial. It has been very partial so far. And I think will likely remain so. And so that's going to constrain the set of counterfactuals we'll probably consider. I.e., we can increase, because so few firms get calls, sort of the, less than 1% of firms get calls. We're less concerned about, say, general equilibrium effects, or this sense in which the information becomes really pervasive. But it's fair to say that how far could you really extrapolate one of these programs before the benefits are largely evaporate because the information becomes ubiquitous? My guess is probably not that much further, right? If you were to target a quarter of firms, for instance, surely the vast majority of firms would learn through peers and neighbors, as someone suggested earlier. So I think what we can do is shed light on how much what the benefits to much more marginal programs would be. And in fairness, we chose 5. We chose the number 5 to increase the number to increase the calls by a factor of 5 Saturday night, so that my co-author could provide me with a set of results for this talk on Sunday, and I could make slides on Monday. So we really weren't sure. We wanted to pick a number big enough that we would get some type of results. The lines wouldn't look completely flat, and we'd be able to describe them a little bit. But I think we are generally thinking of much more marginal changes. There is a deeper question, of course, about the general equilibrium nature of information that I think is a fantastically interesting question. That would be great to work on and think about. I don't have any really clever way to think about identifying it.